The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace as tourists gathered behind the rope barriers, the cameras ready to capture the famous changing of the guard ceremony. Among the crowd stood General Marcus Thompson, a decorated American military officer visiting London on official diplomatic business. His chest bore ribbons from 3 tours of duty, and his presence commanded respect wherever he went. Thompson had arrived early, curious to witness the precision and discipline of the Queen's Guard that he had heard so much about. As a military man himself, he appreciated the tradition and ceremony that came with centuries of British military heritage. The red-coated guards stood motionless at their posts, their tall bearskin hats adding to their imposing presence. What Thompson didn't know was that among these guards stood Private James Mitchell, a young soldier who had joined the Queen's Guard just 6 months ago. Mitchell came from a working-class family in Manchester, where his father had worked double shifts at a factory to support the family. The young soldier had dreamed of serving his country since childhood, inspired by stories his grandfather told about serving in World War II. Mitchell's journey to the Queen's Guard had not been easy. He had struggled through basic training, often falling behind his peers in physical fitness tests. His drill sergeant had been particularly harsh on him, questioning whether he had what it took to represent the crown. But Mitchell possessed something that couldn't be taught: an unwavering determination and a heart full of pride for his country. The training for the Queen's Guard was intense and demanding. Mitchell had to learn to stand perfectly still for hours, regardless of weather conditions or distractions from tourists. He practiced marching with the precision of a clock, his movements synchronized with his fellow guards. The bearskin hat alone weighed over 2 pounds, and in the summer heat, it felt much heavier. During his training, Mitchell had learned about the deep history and significance of his role. The Queen's Guard wasn't just ceremonial. They were active duty soldiers, responsible for protecting the royal palaces and the royal family. Each guard underwent rigorous background checks and psychological evaluations. They were trained marksmen and combat soldiers, not just parade performers. As Thompson watched from the crowd, he noticed the incredible discipline of the guards. They stood like statues, their eyes fixed straight ahead, seemingly unaware of the hundreds of tourists taking pictures and making comments around them. The American general found himself impressed by their composure. Thinking about how difficult it must be to maintain such focus with constant distractions, the crowd grew larger as the ceremony time approached. Children pressed against the barriers, trying to get closer to the guards. Parents lifted their young ones onto their shoulders for better views. Tour guides spoke in various languages, explaining the significance of the ceremony to their groups. The atmosphere was festive and excited. Thompson noticed a group of American tourists nearby, loudly discussing their plans for the day and comparing the British Guards to American military ceremonies they had witnessed. Some were making jokes about the Guards' tall hats and red uniforms, not understanding the serious nature of their duty. As the general continued to observe, he began to appreciate the mental strength required to perform this role. These weren't actors in costumes. They were real soldiers with real weapons, trained to protect and serve. The ceremony was about to begin, and Thompson positioned himself for a better view, unaware that he was about to witness something that would challenge everything he thought he knew about military discipline and human character. The morning air was crisp, and a gentle breeze rustled through the trees surrounding the palace grounds. Mitchell stood at his post, his rifle held perfectly at attention. His mind focused on his duty, despite the growing crowd around him. We could hear the murmur of conversations, the clicking of cameras, and the excited whispers of children. But his training kept him centered and alert. Little did anyone know that this seemingly ordinary morning would become extraordinary, and that the actions of one young guard would teach a seasoned American general a lesson about courage, dignity, and the true meaning of service that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. As the ceremony began, the precision of the Queen's Guard became even more apparent. Their movements were perfectly synchronized, each step measured and deliberate. Thompson watched in admiration as they performed their ancient ritual with flawless execution. The drums beat steadily, and the guards marched in perfect formation. their red tunics bright against the gray stone of the palace. Mitchell was part of the stationary guard, remaining at his post while others participated in the changing ceremony. His job was to maintain his position and remain vigilant, no matter what happened around him. The training had prepared him for almost every situation: tourists trying to get his attention, children making funny faces, and even people attempting to touch his uniform or weapon in the crowd. A middle-aged businessman named Robert Harrison pushed his way closer to the barriers. Harrison was known for his aggressive personality and sense of entitlement. He ran a successful company back in Chicago and wasn't used to being ignored or treated as just another face in the crowd. He had been drinking at his hotel bar earlier that morning, celebrating a business deal, and his judgment was clouded by alcohol and arrogance. Harrison began making loud comments about the guards, criticizing their uniforms and questioning why grown men would stand around playing dress-up. His voice carried over the respectful murmur of other tourists, drawing uncomfortable glances from families nearby. His wife, embarrassed by his behavior, tried to quiet him, but he brushed off her concerns. Thompson noticed the disruptive tourist, but chose to focus on the ceremony, impressed by how the guards maintained their composure despite the growing disturbance. The general had dealt with difficult situations throughout his military career, but he recognized the challenge these guards faced. They had to remain professional while being unable to respond to provocations. As Harrison continued his crude commentary, his attention turned specifically to Mitchell. The young guard stood perfectly still, his eyes focused straight ahead, giving no indication that he heard the increasingly offensive remarks. Harrison seemed to take this as a personal challenge, as if the guard's professional discipline was somehow an insult to him. The businessman stepped closer to the barrier, now directly in front of Mitchell's post. His comments became more personal and insulting, questioning the guard's intelligence and manhood. Other tourists began to move away, uncomfortable with the escalating situation. Some parents covered their children's ears, while others looked around hoping someone in authority would intervene. Thompson felt his own anger rising as he watched the situation unfold. As a military officer, he understood the impossible position. The guard was in. Mitchell couldn't respond without breaking protocol and potentially facing severe disciplinary action. The young soldier had to endure the abuse while maintaining his duty to protect and serve. Harrison's behavior reached a new low when he began making personal attacks about Mitchell's family and background, using language that would be offensive. In any context, the crowd around him had thinned considerably, with most people moving to different viewing areas to escape the uncomfortable scene. Even his own wife had stepped back, clearly ashamed of her husband's conduct. Through it all, Mitchell remained motionless. His training kicked in, and he focused on his breathing and his duty. He thought about his grandfather's stories of enduring much worse conditions during wartime, about the pride his family felt when he earned his position, and about the oath he had taken to serve with honor and dignity. The young guard's resolve was being tested in ways the training manual couldn't have prepared him for. This wasn't about standing still in bad weather or ignoring harmless tourist antics. This was about maintaining his integrity and professionalism in the face of deliberate cruelty and disrespect. Thompson found himself moving closer, his protective instincts as both a military officer and a decent human being compelling him to act. He had seen enough conflicts to know that situations like this could escalate quickly if left unchecked. The general positioned himself where he could intervene if necessary, all while maintaining his respect for the guard's need to handle the situation according to his own protocols. The tension in the air was palpable. Other members of the Queen's Guard, while maintaining their positions, were aware of what was happening. The ceremony continued around them, but this personal battle between a drunk, entitled tourist and a young soldier, trying to do his duty, had become the real focus for those close enough to witness it. Harrison's final insult crossed every line of decency and respect, causing even the most patient observers to gasp in shock. It was at this moment that something inside Mitchell shifted. The young guard was faced with the most difficult decision of his military career. The insult that Harrison hurled at Mitchell was so vicious and personal that it seemed to freeze the entire area around them. The businessman had crossed from general rudeness into territory that attacked everything Mitchell held dear: his family, his service, and his character. The words hung in the air like poison, causing even hardened adults in the crowd to wince at their cruelty. For a moment that seemed to last forever, Mitchell stood completely still. His knuckles whitened slightly as his grip tightened almost imperceptibly on his rifle. His jaw clenched, and for just an instant, his eyes flickered with the kind of anger that comes from being pushed beyond human endurance. Everyone watching held their breath, waiting to see how this young soldier would respond. Thompson had stepped even closer, ready to intervene if the situation exploded into something worse. He had seen good soldiers pushed to their breaking points before, and he recognized the signs. The general's own anger was building, not just at Harrison's behavior, but at the impossible position this guard had been put in by someone who clearly had no understanding of honor or respect. Then something remarkable happened. Instead of losing control or abandoning his post, Mitchell did something that would stay with everyone present for the rest of their lives. He slowly, deliberately, and with perfect military precision, shifted his stance. His movement was so controlled and purposeful that it commanded immediate attention from everyone in the area. Mitchell turned his head just slightly, not breaking protocol, making it clear that he was about to speak. His voice, when it came, was quiet but carried with absolute authority across the courtyard. Every word was measured and deliberate, spoken with the kind of dignity that comes from deep inner strength. "Sir," Mitchell said, his voice steady and clear, "I am here to serve and protect. That includes protecting your right to express yourself, even when your words are meant to harm. I choose to see past your anger to whatever pain might be driving it. I hope you find peace." The simplicity and grace of his response sent shockwaves through the crowd. Here was a young man who had been subjected to the most vicious personal attack, and instead of responding with anger or retaliation, he had chosen compassion and wisdom. His words carried the weight of genuine concern for his tormentor's well-being. Harrison stood, stunned, his mouth hanging open. He had expected anger, confrontation, or at least some kind of reaction that would justify his behavior. Instead, he had been met with kindness and understanding that made his own actions appear even more shameful by comparison. The businessman's face began to change as the reality of his behavior hit him. The crowd around them had grown silent. Parents who had been covering their children's ears now found themselves learning alongside them about dignity under pressure. Other tourists who had moved away began to return, drawn by the powerful moment they sensed was unfolding. Thompson felt his own eyes welling up with emotion. In all his years of military service, through combat zones and diplomatic missions, he had rarely witnessed such a perfect display of what it truly meant to be a soldier. This young guard had just demonstrated more courage and character in 30 seconds than many people show in a lifetime. Mitchell returned to his original position, his movements still perfectly controlled and professional. He didn't look smug or self-satisfied. He simply resumed his duty as if nothing had happened, though something profound had indeed occurred. The young soldier had faced his greatest test and had not just passed it, he had transformed it into a moment of grace. Harrison's wife had tears in her eyes as she looked at her husband with a mixture of shame and disappointment. She had watched the guard's response and then looked at the man she had married, seeing perhaps for the first time how small his behavior had made him appear in comparison to this young soldier's greatness. The businessman himself seemed to shrink before everyone's eyes. The alcohol was wearing off, replaced by a sobering recognition of what he had done and how he had been answered. His face showed the internal struggle of a man confronting his own worst impulses and finding them wanting when measured against real character. Other members of the Queen's Guard, while maintaining their positions, had witnessed their colleagues' handling of the situation. There would be conversations later about what they had seen, not just the abuse Mitchell had endured, but the extraordinary way he had responded to it. His response had elevated not just himself, but everyone who witnessed it. The minutes following Mitchell's response were filled with a heavy silence that seemed to transform everyone present. Harrison stood frozen, his earlier arrogance completely deflated. The weight of his actions pressed down on him as he began to fully comprehend what had just occurred. He had attacked a young man doing his duty with dedication and honor. And that same young man had responded with more grace than Harrison had ever shown in his life. Thompson found himself unable to move away from the scene. As a general who had commanded thousands of soldiers, he thought he understood military discipline and character. But what he had just witnessed went beyond anything he had experienced in his decades of service. This wasn't just about following orders or maintaining composure under pressure. This was about the kind of inner strength that transforms difficult moments into opportunities for human connection. The American general began to reflect on his own career, at the times he had been tested, and on the responses he had chosen in challenging situations. He thought about the young soldiers under his command and wondered if he'd ever taught them anything as valuable as what he had just learned from watching Private Mitchell handle this crisis around the courtyard. Other tourists began to react to what they had witnessed. An elderly woman approached Harrison's wife and quietly said, "That young man just showed us all what real strength looks like." A father knelt down to speak with his young son, using Mitchell's example to teach about kindness and dignity. The guard's response was creating ripples of positive impact throughout the crowd. Harrison's internal struggle was visible on his face. The businessman was experiencing something he hadn't felt in years, genuine shame mixed with admiration for someone he had tried to humiliate. His successful career had been built on aggressive tactics and dominating others. But here he stood, completely outdone by a young soldier who had chosen compassion over conflict. Slowly, Harrison began to walk toward Mitchell's position. His steps were hesitant, unsure. His wife followed at a distance, hope mixed with apprehension on her face. The crowd watched as this man who had been so cruel and loud just minutes before now approached with the uncertainty of someone who had been fundamentally changed by what he had experienced. Thompson positioned himself where he could observe the interaction, his military instincts still alert, but his heart hopeful that something good might come from this encounter. He had seen how conflicts could escalate, but he had also witnessed how the right response could transform enemies into allies. When Harrison reached the barrier closest to Mitchell, he stopped. For a long moment, he simply stood there, looking at the young guard who continued to maintain his professional stance. The businessman's hands shook slightly as he struggled to find words that could somehow address what he had done. Harrison began, his voice barely above a whisper. Cleared his throat and tried again. "I don't know what came over me. What I said to you was inexcusable." His voice grew stronger as he continued. "You didn't deserve that. No one deserves that. And the way you responded, ... He paused, struggling with emotions he wasn't used to. Expressing Mitchell, while maintaining his position, allowed his eyes to briefly meet Harrison's. In that moment of connection, the guard saw not an enemy, but a human being who was genuinely struggling with his own actions. The soldier's expression softened almost imperceptibly, offering silent acknowledgement of Harrison's attempt to make amends. "You showed me something today," Harrison continued, his voice now carrying genuine respect. "You showed me what it means to be a better man than I am. I've spent my life thinking that strength meant defeating others, but you just proved that real strength means lifting others up, even when they don't deserve it." The crowd around them had grown larger as words spread about the exchange taking place, but the attention didn't seem to matter anymore. This had become a moment of genuine human connection that transcended the ceremonial setting and the watching eyes. Thompson felt his respect for both men growing. Harrison was showing the courage it takes to admit wrongdoing and seek to make things right, while Mitchell continued to demonstrate the kind of character that elevated everyone around him. The general realized he was witnessing something rare, a moment where conflict had been transformed into understanding through the power of one person's choice to respond with dignity rather than retaliation. The businessman reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, but then stopped and put it back. Material gestures seemed inadequate for what was happening here. Instead, he simply said, "Thank you for reminding me who I want to be." As Harrison stepped back from the barrier, his wife approached him with tears streaming down her face. She had watched her husband's transformation from arrogant aggressor to humbled human being. She was seeing glimpses of the man she had first fallen in love with years ago. "I'm proud of you for apologizing," she whispered to him, taking his arm gently. That took real courage. Thompson could no longer remain a silent observer. The general approached Harrison and his wife, his own emotions clearly visible, despite his military bearing. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying the authority of his rank, but softened by genuine respect. "I couldn't help but witness what just happened here. I'm General Marcus Thompson, United States Army." Harrison looked up, surprised by the intervention of this clearly high-ranking military officer. "I'm afraid you saw me at my absolute worst." "General," he said, shame evident in his voice, "I have no excuse for my behavior." "What I saw," Thompson replied firmly, "is a man who made a mistake and then had the courage to face it and try to make it right. That matters more than you might think." He turned toward Mitchell, who maintained his professional stance, but was clearly listening. "And I saw a soldier who demonstrated the kind of character that makes me proud to wear a uniform." The general's words carried weight that went beyond simple compliments. Thompson had earned his rank through decades of service, and his acknowledgement meant something significant to both men. He continued, "In my 30 years of military service, I've learned that true strength isn't about never falling down, it's about how you choose to get back up." A small crowd had gathered around this unusual conversation, drawn by the obvious importance of what was taking place. Among them were other military personnel visiting London, some British citizens, and tourists from various countries. Sensed they were witnessing something meaningful, though many didn't fully understand the depths of what had occurred. Thompson turned back to Harrison. "I'd like to share something with you, if you don't mind. In my experience, the people who can recognize genuine character when they see it, even in the middle of their own worst moments, are usually people who have that character within themselves. They've just lost sight of it temporarily." Harrison's wife squeezed her husband's arm, her eyes bright with hope. She had been married to him for 15 years and had watched success and pressure gradually change him from the kind, thoughtful man she had married into someone harder and more cynical. Seeing him respond to Mitchell's grace with genuine remorse and humility reminded her of why she had fallen in love with him. General Harrison said, "I run a company back in Chicago. We employ over 200 people. After what I witnessed here today, I realize I need to take a hard look at how I've been treating the people who work for me, if I can learn to show half the dignity that young man just showed me. Maybe I can become a better leader." Thompson smiled, recognizing the kind of self-reflection that often follows encounters with truly exceptional character. "That's exactly the right response," he said, "and I suspect your employees will notice the difference immediately." Mitchell, still maintaining his post, had been listening to every word of this conversation. While he couldn't participate directly, the young soldier felt a deep satisfaction knowing that his choice to respond with compassion rather than anger had created this moment of connection and growth between strangers. This was why he served, not for recognition or glory, but for the opportunity to make a positive difference in the world. The ceremony around them had continued, but for the small group gathered near Mitchell's post, something more significant than the changing of the guard had taken place. They had witnessed the changing of hearts and minds, the transformation that becomes possible when one person chooses to respond to hatred with love, to insults with dignity, and to aggression with peace. Thompson looked at his watch and realized his diplomatic schedule required him to leave soon, but he found himself reluctant to end this encounter. "I wonder," he said to Harrison, "if you would be interested in staying in touch. I have a feeling that this conversation we've started today could benefit from continuation." Harrison nodded eagerly. "I would be honored, General. I have a lot to learn, and it's clear that both you and that remarkable young man could teach me things I desperately need to know." As the three men exchanged contact information, Mitchell allowed himself a small, barely visible smile. His choice to respond with grace had not only protected his own integrity, but had created connections between people who might never have spoken otherwise. As the formal ceremony concluded and the crowds began to disperse, Thompson found himself lingering in the courtyard. He approached Mitchell's position one final time, waiting for the appropriate moment when the guard's duties would allow for a brief interaction. The general had commanded thousands of soldiers, but he had never felt more compelled to acknowledge one individual's exceptional conduct. When Mitchell's shift ended and he was relieved by another guard, Thompson was waiting respectfully nearby. The young soldier, now able to move and speak freely, was surprised to find himself face to face with a high-ranking American general who clearly wanted to speak with him. "Private Mitchell," Thompson said, having learned the guard's name from a nearby officer. "I hope you don't mind me introducing myself, General Thompson, and I wanted to personally thank you for what I witnessed today." Your response to that difficult situation was nothing short of extraordinary. Mitchell stood at attention, unsure how to respond to such high praise from a foreign military officer. "Thank you, sir. I was just doing my duty as I understood it." "No," Thompson said, firmly but kindly. "What you did went far beyond duty. You turned a moment of cruelty into a lesson in humanity. That businessman, Harrison, left here a changed man because of how you chose to respond. That's not something they teach in military training. That comes from character that runs much deeper than any uniform." The young guard's humility was evident as he struggled to accept the praise. "My grandfather always told me that we have a choice in every moment about who we want to be. Today, I chose to be someone he would be proud of." Thompson felt a deep emotional connection to this young man's words. "Your grandfather was a wise man, and I have no doubt he would be incredibly proud of you today. But I want you to know that your impact didn't end with Mr. Harrison. Every person who witnessed what happened here today learned something about dignity, compassion, and real strength." As they spoke, several other people approached, wanting to express their own gratitude. To Mitchell, an elderly veteran thanked him for representing military service with such honor. A young mother told him that she would use his example to teach her children about responding to bullies with kindness rather than anger. A teenage boy said he had decided he wanted to serve his country after seeing Mitchell's demonstration of what military service really meant. Meanwhile, Harrison and his wife had returned to their hotel room, where a profound conversation was taking place. Robert, his wife, said, "I saw something in your eyes today that I haven't seen in years. When that young man responded to your cruelty with kindness, it broke something open in you, didn't it?" Harrison nodded, still processing the emotional impact of the morning's events. "I've been so angry for so long, Margaret. Angry about business. Pressures about getting older, about feeling like I had to fight everyone to get respect. But that soldier showed me that real respect comes from how you treat others, especially when they can't fight back." "What are you going to do when we get home?" she asked, hope evident in her voice. "Going to start by apologizing to every person I've treated poorly at the company. Then I'm going to figure out how to lead with the kind of dignity that young Mose man showed today. It might take time to change habits I've built over years, but I have to try." Back at the palace, Thompson was preparing to leave for his next diplomatic appointment. But the impact of what he had witnessed was already changing how he thought about leadership and military service. He realized that in all his focus on strategy, tactics, and command structure, he had sometimes lost sight of the simple human connections that make military service meaningful. The general made a mental note to share Mitchell's story with his own soldiers when he returned to the United States, not as an example of British superiority, but as a demonstration of the universal values that unite all people who choose to serve others with honor and dignity. 6 months later, Thompson received a letter from Harrison. The businessman had transformed. His company culture implemented new policies based on respect and dignity, and had seen both employee satisfaction and business performance improve dramatically. He had also started volunteering at a veteran support center, inspired by his encounter with Mitchell to give back to those who serve. Mitchell, meanwhile, continued his service with the Queen's Guard, unaware of the lasting impact his moment of grace had created. He remained the same humble, dedicated soldier he had always been. But his story had begun to spread through military circles as an example of how individual character can create positive change in ways that extend far beyond any single moment. Ripple effects of one young soldier's choice to respond to hatred with compassion continued to expand. touching lives and changing perspectives in ways that none of them could have imagined when the morning began. It had proven that sometimes the most powerful response to aggression is not greater aggression, but the quiet strength that comes from choosing to see the humanity in every person, even those who seem determined to forget their own.